Right. Before we start, can we get two, settle down please. Before we start, two brief administrative things. First of all, as announced in my Vital post, today's lecture will not have a break. This is because I have to leave at 5:30 rather than 5:45. So no break today. Secondly, more importantly, the student register. Can we get this through more efficiently today? Because it's rather annoying, not just for me, I'm paid for it, but for all your fellow students to have to stick around after the end of the lecture to sign their register. To just explain briefly the system, you sign it and then you give it to the other student, okay? It sounds tricky, but once you get the hang of it, it really is quite straightforward, okay? Thank you. Right, today I'm going to talk to you about European modernism between the wars. But before I do that, I think I should say a few words about the term modernism, which is a slightly problematic term. Here in this country, the term modernism was originally used in a sort of derogatory fashion, describing a sort of architecture, wide-rendered, boxy, flat-roofed architecture, coming over from the continent, and particularly from the German-speaking countries, which was in itself reason enough for some people to reject it. In 1934, one of the most vocal opponents of this new architecture, a man called Sir Reginald Blomfield, even referred to it, to the term in its German form, Modernismus, to emphasize its German origin and therefore its profoundly un-English nature. In recent years, the term modernism has largely lost this negative connotation, but you can see that none of these famous American and English historians use the term modernism in the title of their books. They use modern architecture rather than modernism. The reason why I mention this in this context is because in German, as well as in French and other European languages, so the area where this architecture originates, there is to the present day a distinction between modern architecture and modernism. The former, modern architecture, describing a fundamentally new approach to architecture beyond stylistic ideas, and the latter, modernism, describing the recognizable formal characteristics of this new architecture, even if they're only applied in a sort of superficial manner to otherwise traditional projects. This distinction between architectural approach and stylistic application is the lingering legacy of those who developed modern architecture, and to some extent it perpetuates their propaganda. However, it does give us some idea what they intended their new architecture to be. They saw modern architecture as a reaction to the stylistic confusion which had raged through the 19th century. Unlike previous eras, the 19th century never managed to create a unified architectural language which was entirely of its own time. Instead, architects would employ a variety of styles, Neo-Baroque, Neo-Renaissance, Neo-Gothic, etc., often in the same place and at the same time. Professor Ray illustrated this last week by showing us the Ring Road scheme in Vienna, where he had all sorts of stylistic frivolities at the same place. In the 19th century, architectural design amounted to little more than facade decoration. And one of the key aims of the modernist pioneers was to move away from such superficialities and marry their architecture to what they considered to be the true accomplishments of their period, notably engineering structures. To them, this involved a fundamental change in approach, which went to the core of architectural thinking and had implications that reached far beyond mere stylistic ideas. Now, 90 minutes might seem quite a long time to sit through a lecture. It's even longer if you actually have to give the lecture. But it is a very short time to cover such an important and rich period in architectural history. And I have made some momentous decisions limiting my task, and I think I should tell you what these limitations are. The first of these limitations may seem rather obvious. What I'm proposing today is primarily a story of architects and their buildings. It is not a story of the various theories and books which accompanied and justified these buildings. This is a personal choice of mine because I have serious doubts about the impact of theory on buildings quite generally. More often than not, the opposite seems to be the case. I will mention some key writings insofar as they will help us understand what we see on the slides. But on the whole, I would like this to be a narrative driven by buildings, and the very least I will do is to show you some really, really good architecture along the way. And secondly, there are geographical limitations. Now, I'm going to speak about Western Europe only. This is, in fact, quite a severe limitation because one must say that the developments in Russia, especially, mirrored the developments in Western Europe. The reason why I excluded them here is because although there was some mutual exchange between East and West, Soviet Russia was, to some extent, and increasingly so, really a world of its own. And the more important reason is the fact that although theoretically the Russians were certainly, or generally the Eastern Europeans were generally on a level with Western Europeans, it wasn't until the mid-1920s that their theories and ideas began to manifest themselves in major building projects, years after this was the case in Western Europe. The third limitation is topical and even more severe. The idea that architecture is more than just buildings, but stretches from the smallest scale, industrial design, furniture, typefaces, to the very largest, town planning, is really a key tenet of modernist thinking. However, to keep my talk as coherent and intelligible as possible, I will be limiting myself to architecture in a narrower sense, quite reluctantly, I must say, because modern town planning is a particularly interesting subject area. The fourth and final limitation is temporal. The title says European modernism between the wars, but in fact I will be starting a little bit earlier than that and cover the period up until 1933 when the Nazis took power in Germany, which pretty much dealt the death blow to European modernism in its formative period. The simple truth is that we cannot have a continental movement of any significance if the Germans aren't part of it. It's just too large and important a country, particularly at that time. Now, my talk is divided into three parts. The first part will link up and slightly overlap with Professor Ray's talk of last week, insofar as I will be talking about the work of three architects whose work prior to the First World War was an attempt to change attitudes and conventions in architecture, and who thereby anticipated some of the changes which would then come to full fruition 10 years later. Two of these architects you met already, Auguste Perret and Adolf Loos, and the third one, Peter Behrens, you really need to meet as well. The main part will be about the emergence of modernism after the First World War. I think it's important to understand this development as the result of simultaneous and at times contradictory efforts made by more or less isolated groups in various parts of Europe, largely in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Austria, and in Switzerland. I have identified three such modernist strands, and these are the ones which I personally consider to be the most important ones. Three of them are actual sub-movements, Expressionism, Der Style, and Neue Sachlichkeit, and the other two are individual architects, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier, who were so important, they were almost a movement in themselves. I will conclude by briefly talking about the question of modernism as an international style, and I will focus on the Weissenhof estate, a model estate in Stuttgart, southern Germany, which brought together these different groups in a surprisingly coherent fashion. That was in 1927, and it really marks the birth of modernism as an international and more or less unified movement, cut short temporarily by political developments in Germany and, of course, the Second World War. So let us start with our so-called proto-modernist, which admittedly is not a very elegant label. These are basically architects whose work anticipated some of the features which would characterize modernism in the following decades, but who still combine these features with more traditional ones. The first of our proto-modernists is Auguste Perret, and the topic which interests us here is reinforced concrete, or rather the use of reinforced concrete in a non-industrial context. Now, by the end of the 19th century, reinforced concrete became increasingly important in an engineering context, most notably for the construction of large-span factory buildings and bridges. The key figure here was a French engineer and builder called François Hennebique, who in the late 1870s began to use concrete as a fireproof protection for wrought iron beams. Hennebique soon realized that it would be a lot more economic if steel were used where the material is in tension and concrete where the material is in compression, thereby using the specific properties of each material. In 1892, he patented a pioneering system which for the first time created a monolithic joint between the two materials. Although you can see quite clearly on the top left picture over there that the structural thinking behind it was still essentially that of a timber structure with a distinction between primary carrier and secondary carrier. So reinforced concrete was the quintessential new engineering material, and to introduce it into the domain of architecture was an important symbolic step in closing the gap between architecture and engineering. This was a key concern of modernist architects, and we will come back to it later on. Now remember 2 weeks ago I showed you very briefly Rainey McIntosh's Glasgow School of Art, where he used exposed reinforced concrete for his lintels to span the wide window openings. The first architect who used reinforced concrete in a domestic context was Auguste Perret in his apartment block on Rue Franklin, which you can see here on the right-hand side. Now, structurally, this was not a particularly advanced building. Just like Hennebique, in his structural thinking, Perret was still very much sort of married to traditional trabeated post and lintel structures. However, what Perret did do was he showed the concrete skeleton, even though you can see that it's still covered in decorative plates. But nonetheless, the structure is clearly visible, which at the time, when all his neighbors, all the neighboring buildings were still in a very much historicist, eclecticist style, was really a shocking novelty. Only 3 years later, Perret went one step further and showed an exposed reinforced concrete frame entirely unadorned. That would be the Pontier Garage on the left-hand side. I should perhaps mention that Frank Lloyd Wright did pretty much the same thing in his Unity Temple in Oak Park, Illinois, and at pretty much the same time. However, in Europe, Perret was undoubtedly the first who did this, which is why we must include him in our survey of pioneers of European modernism. The second architect we want to briefly discuss is Adolf Loos again. What interests us here is not the usage and display of a specific material. Loos did not do that. What interests us here is the idea of developing an architectural design from inside to outside. That was a key principle of modern architecture, and one that sets it apart from the preceding historicist architecture. In the 19th century, architects had been primarily concerned with the shape and appearance of their buildings. Modern architects were primarily interested in space. And this is what Loos pioneered. His unique contribution, you've heard of it before, was the so-called Raumplan, the spatial plan. Professor Ray explained it briefly, and you can see a prime example here on this slide, the Villa Müller in Prague. Now, the basic idea about the Raumplan is to see a building as a three-dimensional entity made up of a combination of individual spatial units. Loos did not think that a lavatory should have the same size and height as a living room, nor did he think that it should have the same size of windows. Consequently, he defined the dimensions of each room according to its specific purpose, and he linked these rooms through a variety of steps and stairs in response to the differences in height. Now, windows were positioned centrally in each room, and their size related to the size and importance of each room. The elevations result directly from this interior arrangement with blatant disregard as to how this looks from the outside. Now, the Raumplan implied an additive, informal design method, and the most useful way is to think of it as a game of Tetris. Those combined individual spatial units of varying dimensions, and he fit them all into a neat cube. So although he did not care much about the elevations of his buildings, he did care about their shape. And on the whole, this is slightly contradictory if you think about it, and I would like you to bear this in mind when we look at their style later on. Now you can see some of the spatial complexity which results from Loos' design approach with these orgy of steps and stairs sort of zigzagging through the building. Loos was very proud that his buildings didn't photograph well. To him, architecture was a fundamentally three-dimensional discipline which could never be truthfully represented through a two-dimensional medium. Now, for the same reason, floor plans are not usually very useful when looking at a building of Loos. Now, Loos fully developed the Raumplan in the mid-1920s. And if you look at the date here, this building was built in 1930 at the heyday of modernism. If we want to discuss him as a modernist pioneer, we will have to look at a building that was built a lot earlier than that. This slide shows the Villa Steiner of 1910, so 20 years earlier. And I think you can clearly see how this one is somewhere in the middle, something not quite there yet. As early as 1910, Loos already had this completely ornament-free, nude, monochrome white box. 2 years prior, Loos had published a wonderfully polemic essay under the title Ornament and Crime, in which he rejected any ornamentation of the building's skin as profoundly immoral. Briefly summarized, Loos argued that by omitting ornamentation, modern architecture could overcome the aberrations of the previous century, whose lavish facade decorations he interpreted as a reflection of its decadence and dishonesty. Loos considered it an outright crime to force craftsmen to waste their time and efforts on unnecessary and obsolete surface decoration unless it arose sort of organically from the materials themselves or from their mastery of their materials. Ruskin had made a very similar point, and Loos, who was he had the greatest admiration for the English culture, really took his clues from the English arts and crafts movement. So there were these modernist elements, lack of ornament, flat roof, wide surfaces, etc. But at the same time, there was still the relics of a more traditional approach, specifically in this very unmodernist distinction between the front, the main facade, and sort of the side elevation. If you look at these two pictures there, they almost look like they show two different buildings. In the case of the main street-facing front, which is the one here on the right-hand side, there's also still a certain trace of classical facade composition, in particular an interest in symmetry, which Lawes, unlike many of his colleagues, never really abandoned completely. However, you can also see that he was not a slave to this principle. Take note of this symmetrical position of much smaller window here. The reason for this was that behind this window here, there's a large living kitchen. Behind this window here, there's only the vestibules. There's simply no functional need to have an equally sized window here. And Lawes was more than willing to compromise on look if it didn't make functional sense. You may wonder about this strange barrel or semi-barrel shaped roof. This was Lawes' ingenious way of getting planning permission for a three-story building on a site where building regulations only allowed for a one-story front towards the road. The third architect we want to briefly discuss is an interesting man called Peter Behrens. Behrens was a founding member of an organization called the Deutsche Werkbund, which Professor Ray mentioned in passing last week, but which we should explain in a little bit more detail because it's quite impossible to overstate the importance of this organization in the history of modern architecture. The Werkbund was founded in 1909 as a lobby group of artists and industrial manufacturers who sought to improve the quality of German products in order to make them more appealing and therefore more sellable on international markets, an idea which has to be seen in the context of this growing industrial, economic and ultimately political rivalry with the British Empire. What was remarkable about the Werkbund was the scope of ambition. The Werkbund did not limit its activities to product design per se, but aimed at improving the quality of the built environment as a whole. And they did this by organizing a series of seminal architecture exhibitions, a couple of which we will discuss later on. The basic idea was that the same precision and economy of means that goes into the design and fabrication of industrial products should also be applied to architecture. And Peter Behrens really embodied this idea. He was the designer in charge for the German electricity giant AEG, for which he designed what is perhaps the first example of a corporate design. He designed absolutely anything, from light bulbs to advertisement posters to industrial plants. So really the entire range of AEG products. The most famous of his industrial buildings is this turbine factory in Berlin, which is still used by the same company today. Now, like the previous examples of Perret and of Lawes, this building is in a sense a transitional project, which combines modernist elements with more traditional ones. At first, it looks like a typical, perhaps slightly gentrified industrial building with this sort of neoclassical frontage, the massive corners to either side. However, in reality, the load-bearing structure here is confined to these 22 girder frames, which you can see here. Now, the box section of these frames looks something like this. So it's thicker on top and thinner at the bottom, which means that you have a vertical outer edge and an inclined inner edge. And Behrens highlighted or articulated the structural system by aligning this window front with the inclined inner edge rather than the vertical outer edge. The same happens here with these seemingly massive corners. From afar, this looks like a massive stone facing, but coming closer, you realize that this is in fact only a thin concrete membrane divided or structured through these green painted metal bands, and along with the same inclination, the fact that it slants inward, clearly reveals these corners as non-supported elements. Okay? So from afar, you think, oh yeah, two massive corners carrying this building in a traditional sense. But coming closer or looking closer, you realize, hang on, these corners don't carry anything. Okay? So very clever. The same, by the way, happens on top. This wall bit above this main window, which in the Greek temple would be called the tympanon, where you have exactly the same thin concrete membrane, also framed by this green painted metal framing. So unlike the previous architecture, where the structural system was hidden behind elaborate facade designs, a turbine factory gives you a very clear idea as to how it works. A very interesting, very significant building, which just shows how canny or how savvy Behrens was in the handling of architectural and structural elements. A really good architect. Now, Peter Behrens was one of the leading architects in Germany at the time, and many of the younger talents were eager to gain work experience in his flourishing practice. The three most important architects of the 1920s, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, and Le Corbusier, all worked for Behrens prior to the First World War. His influence is most evident in the early work of Walter Gropius, and before we move to our main section, we should take a look at the first building Gropius designed after leaving Behrens' employment. Now you can see that, again, this is an industrial building, and the fact alone that both Behrens and Gropius associated themselves with industrial architecture is noteworthy. One characteristic element of the 19th and early 20th century was this rift between engineering and architecture, epitomized by St. Pancras Station, which Professor Ray showed you last week, where the artistic hotel is completely divorced from the adjacent utilitarian train shed. The fact that creatively ambitious architects such as Behrens and Gropius took on the design of a factory is highly significant, because it was a deliberate attempt at bringing architecture and engineering together, similarly to Perret's use of an engineering material in an architectural context. One must say that Gropius, in particular, was more alive to this issue than anyone else at the time. As early as 1910, he predicted and advocated the use of industrial methods, specifically large-scale prefabrication in building, decades before this actually happened, and of course inspired by Paxton's Crystal Palace. Now, the interesting thing about the Fagus design is that it already had planning permission when the owner asked Gropius to revise its look. In other words, plans and structure were given. All Gropius was asked to do was to redesign the envelope, and he did this by employing a similar syntax to Behrens at the turbine factory, but sort of in reverse effect. Here it is the brick-faced frame which is set back, and the window bits protrude slightly, seemingly suspended from this upstand at roof level. The most conspicuous change is, of course, this glazed corner, the transparency of the corners, the way this thin glass envelope wraps around unsupported corners, which was to become one of the telltales of modern architecture. The slickness and crispness of the Fagus design illustrates how Gropius tried to let the precision of industrial manufacturing inform the look of his building. It marks the birth of what would later be called machine aesthetic. And aesthetically, rather than structurally, it really was the blueprint for much that followed, specifically after the Second World War. Now, the story as it portrays itself so far might suggest a sort of linear progression from 19th century engineering via our proto-modernist straight into modernist or functionalist architecture. But of course, things were not quite as straightforward as this. And this brings us to the first part of our main section, German Expressionism. Before we do that, can I just check what happened to that student register? Who's got it? Oh, come on, play along. Who's got the student? There it is. Okay. Right. In my introductory talk 2 weeks ago, I outlined the events which led up to the First World War, and there's no need to go into any more detail at this point. Suffice it to say that it was, amongst other things, a war for global market shares. In light of this, one can see parallels between the cultural and economic expansionism which drove the early endeavors of the Werkbund and the national sense of entitlement which led Germany into conflict with other countries, notably the British Empire. The First World War, of course, ended in catastrophic defeat for the German Reich. And this cast fundamental doubts not only on the ideological foundations of organizations such as the Werkbund, but also, and more generally, the blind faith in technological progress as a force for good. In more practical terms, the economic situation in Germany, with severe inflation, also meant that for the foreseeable future, very little would be built at all on German soil. As is often the case when the situation doesn't allow for any sustained building activity, it proves a very fruitful time for fantastic visionary projects. And many of the leading architects got absorbed into a very forceful movement called Expressionism. Now, this was primarily a literary and artistic movement oscillating between a fascination with war and a horror of war, which was seen as the climax of an uncontrolled and dehumanizing process of industrialization. I think Otto Dix's self-portrait as the god of war sort of catches this ambivalence quite well. German society, as you probably know, collapsed after the war and fell apart into equally radical and equally powerful left and right-wing factions, the communists on the one hand and the National Socialists on the other. In architecture, this sense of division inspired a number of utopian, almost religious proposals for imaginary cities and structures which would reunite the nation in the form of a new classless and apolitical society. And the most famous of these projects was Bruno Taut's Alpine architecture, which envisaged collective glass structures rising from their alpine surroundings. Taut also designed this so-called city crown as the unifying structure of this new integrated community, similar in character and purpose to a cathedral in a medieval city. Architecturally, Taut's scheme was a further development of a spectacular building he designed for the Werkbund exhibition of 1914. This was a small glass pavilion financed by the glass industry, so by a variety of glass manufacturers. So essentially an advertisement object for their products, which included glass bricks and glass panes in various colors. Inspired by Gothic cathedrals, and particularly one would suspect the colorful cathedrals of Italy and France, Taut combined these products to great kaleidoscopic effect in what was, in today's parlance, the icon of the exhibition. A more obvious precursor than the Gothic cathedrals was, of course, Paxton's Crystal Palace. However, unlike the Crystal Palace, which was closed at dusk, and whose full-scale glazing had the clear functional purpose of actually getting light into the exhibition hall, Taut's glass pavilion was not about illuminating any exhibits. It was itself the exhibit. And Taut's ambitions were of a considerably higher spiritual order. To him, the glazing of the walls and the multifaceted roof allowed visitors to become one with the entire universe. And the desired effect was not limited to those who actually visited the pavilion. It was visible from very far away. The 1910s and 1920s had, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, seen the electrification of Germany. And this new technology made it possible to illuminate the glass pavilion in the evenings and achieve this crystalline effect, which Taut would later pick up in his fantastic schemes we saw on the last slide. Now, Taut's crystalline aesthetic was a key feature of Expressionist architecture, and you can see it realized in a similar vein on the left-hand side in Hans Pölzig's Great Theatre, sadly since destroyed. The black and white picture doesn't show it, but these rows of stalactites were painted blood red and justified, oddly enough, on acoustical grounds. Obviously, they were first and foremost applied decoration. Fritz Höger's sublime Chili House in Hamburg, which still exists, achieves its effects by architectural means. What is stunning is this extreme verticality and also the intricate brickwork, both of which are also the determining features of this technical administration building by Peter Behrens for Höchst in Frankfurt. Now, with their sculpted and interlaced brick walls and their vertical emphasis, both the Chili House and the Höchst building are reminiscent of and clearly inspired by Gothic cathedrals. You can see a pattern emerging here with this reference to Gothic cathedrals. We will come back to this in just a moment. Now, many historians have brushed the Expressionist period aside as a brief deviation from the true path that modernism was taking. Taut himself referred to it as an explosion of madness that interrupted the development of a modern architecture. However, it would be inappropriate to completely ignore this short period, not least because it gave birth to what was arguably the most important institution in the history of modern architecture, the Bauhaus. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about the Bauhaus and specifically about the educational approach of the Bauhaus in our final lecture this term. For now, just the basics. Now, Walter Gropius created the Bauhaus in 1919 by merging two existing schools, one an art academy and the other one a school of applied arts. Like his master Behrens, Gropius was a prophet of industrialized, rationalized architecture, was not immune to the esoteric tendencies which captivated Germany after the war. Inspired by the way in which Gothic cathedrals had elevated the collective spirit of medieval people, Gropius set his Bauhaus up as an idealized community of artists and craftsmen who would participate in the creation of a total work of art. Lionel Feininger's woodcut from the cover of the founding declaration of the Bauhaus, I think, shows both this inspiration through Gothic cathedrals, but also the extreme left-wing bias of the Bauhaus, which was a constant feature of the Bauhaus and would eventually bring about its downfall. Gropius believed that medieval cathedrals had been the outcome of a collaborative and selfless effort between craftsmen without any participation by a self-conscious designer or architect. This is completely inaccurate, as you will find out in our final lecture this term, but it does explain why there was in fact no architecture department at the Bauhaus, at least not in its early years. It also explains the educational approach itself, which aimed at dissolving the boundaries between the various disciplines. There were two key measures by which Gropius hoped to achieve this. One was the famous fall course, preliminary foundation course, mandatory for all students regardless of their field of specialization, set up by the eccentric Swiss painter Johannes Itten. It was assumed that students arrived at the Bauhaus filled with cultural preconceptions and cliches. The first-year preliminary course would allow students to unlearn these preconceptions and unleash their individual creativity so that they could tackle the unprecedented task of the new age without any mental barriers. This involved experimentation with materials and abstract forms, but also, as you can see on the picture on the left-hand side, breathing techniques, free dance, meditation, etc. The second measure to bring the various disciplines of the Bauhaus together was a focus on group working. The slide shows the Sommerfeld House, a three-story timber frame villa in the outskirts of Berlin. The Sommerfeld House was a so-called live project. It was designed by Gropius, but it was built in collaboration between all or a majority of his students from the various departments. Students also contributed to the detailing and decoration, and this timber paneling and also these decorative panels there, they were designed by a student called Jost Schmidt, later a teacher at the Bauhaus as well. Now, beyond the enduring legacy of the Bauhaus in design and architectural terms, both the first-year foundation course and this idea of group working were groundbreaking educational measures, which, as you certainly know, are still very much part of design education today. So much about the Bauhaus, which in the first couple of years of its existence embodied this utopian expressionist spirit, with almost all members of staff committed to the expressionist line. This changed with the arrival of a man called Theo van Doesburg, a Dutch painter and later architect. Doesburg never trained as an architect, and he built a grand total of 2 houses in his career, so I'm using the term architect lightly. But anyway, Doesburg gave guest lectures in Weimar in 1921, and this brings us to the second of our modernist strands, De Stijl. May I check again how far we are with that student register? Excellent. Now, De Stijl was a group of predominantly Dutch artists and architects centered upon a magazine with the same name, which the group published from October 1917 onwards. The slide shows you the cover of the first issue of De Stijl, designed by a Hungarian painter called Vilmos Huszár. The core members of the group were Doesburg, the painter Piet Mondrian, and the architect and furniture designer Gerrit Rietveld. Like German Expressionism, De Stijl was, broadly speaking, a reaction to the First World War. Yet the approach that the De Stijl group took was entirely different, almost contrary. Theirs was an intellectual rather than an emotional response. The group interpreted the war as a consequence of the exaggerated individualism and self-absorption of individual people, and therefore also of nations. And they put forward a new conception of plastic art based on a purely rational, anti-individualist, anti-naturalist aesthetic. In other words, by eliminating natural or naturalistic restrictions, the group hoped to arrive at a universally valid and pure expression of art, based on immutable and eternal laws. Bit of a Renaissance idea, really. So this universal aesthetic, which they called neoplasticism, was limited to rectangular planar compositions in saturated primary colors. I assume you're all familiar with Mondrian's famous paintings. The first example how this neoplastic aesthetic could be projected into 3 dimensions was Gerrit Rietveld's famous red-blue chair on the right-hand side. That was in 1917. Doesburg himself produced a series of axonometric drawings showing hypothetical architectural structures consisting of bars and planes, sort of articulated, displaced elements in space. I would like you to appreciate the fundamental difference between Doesburg's approach and someone like Loos. Loos creates space by adding and building up cellular units, and this creates the space. Doesburg does the exact opposite. He starts from a large, in fact, infinite space, within which he then defines smaller spatial units. Conceptually, the exact opposite. Doesburg himself published a manifesto under the title 16 Points of a Plastic Architecture, in which he called for an architecture which was, amongst other things, functional, unmonumental and dynamic, anti-decorative in its color, and, most importantly, anti-cubic in its form, again in clear contrast to what Loos, for instance, was doing. Gerrit Rietveld's astonishing End of Terrace in Utrecht, the Schröder-Schrader-Haus, of 1924, is a manifestation of these ideas. You can see how functional space cells are not packed into one closed cube, but sort of pushed out from the center to the exterior space, which thus becomes an extension of the interior. There's a marked visual independence of the various elements of the building, emphasized by the strategic use of color. Now you can see how the walls are all kept in sort of gray, whitish tones, and then certain vertical and horizontal elements are highlighted through saturated primary colors. This strategic use of colors in connection with architecture was a core idea of this style. Doesburg rejected the traditional primacy of architecture over art. To him, the two were equals. Architecture was to create the building as a constructive, closed sculpture, and painting was to open it up through the application of colors. So essentially, the polarity between construction and destruction. And the architect's task was to stabilize, the painter's task was to destabilize. The interiors of the Schröder-Schrader-Haus are, as you can see, based on rectangles and squares and planes, and despite it being a traditional timber frame building or brick and timber structure, the living room on the upper floor is one large continuous space, transformable through a series of partition walls. Now the plan at the bottom here shows the ground floor, and these two plans show the upper floor here as one continuous space, and on top, subdivided through these sliding or folding partition walls, which you can see here as well in an open form. Doesburg and his Textile group had an immense impact on Bauhaus students, and not least on Gropius himself. In the 2 years following Doesburg's stint at Weimar, the Bauhaus gradually turned away from its medieval workshop approach towards a preoccupation with industrial production more in line with pre-war Werkbund ideas. The final push towards a more objective approach came with the departure in 1923 of Johannes Itten, whom you saw earlier doing his breathing exercises with his first-year students, and the growing influence of yet another modernist tendency called Neue Sachlichkeit. The German term Neue Sachlichkeit is usually translated as new objectivity, but more precisely it means new matter-of-factness. To some extent, Neue Sachlichkeit was a response to this esoteric utopianism of the Expressionists, which its supporters countered with their enthusiasm for the immediate and objective reality of things, without obvious idealism, although, of course, this very radical, matter-of-fact approach was an idealism of sorts. The movement, again, gathered around a magazine, which really is a recurring theme in the history of modern architecture. In this case, it was a magazine that was published in Switzerland between 1924 and 1928 under the title ABC, Contributions to Building. The leading figures were a Russian architect, El Lissitzky, and a Dutch architect, Mart Stam, who arrived together from Berlin and acquired a very active following amongst young left-wing Swiss architects. The ABC group rejected the aesthetic bias of both expressionism and this style, and concerned itself with questions of building economy, and therefore of scientifically calculated and optimized lightweight structures. They coined the memorable phrase, building times weight equals monumentality, meaning that the lighter a building was, the less monumental it was, and therefore the better. In keeping with this scientific, obsessively rational approach, the group aimed at finding normative standards in architecture. For instance, rooms were to be dimensioned, arranged, and economically optimized based on an exact analysis of their respective purpose. In other words, this marks the beginning of what would subsequently be called functionalism. The most notable amongst the Swiss members of the group was a man called Hannes Meyer. Meyer glorified technology and dismissed art as being utterly irrelevant to architecture. And the slide shows a textbook example of his functionalist design approach. It is the unbuilt competition project for a school in Basel, Switzerland. Meyer argued that classrooms should benefit from maximum light and fresh air, and he therefore lifted them from the ground with the ground floor on top, given to parking facilities and a swimming pool gym. Playground areas for the children are located on the flat roof, which, as you can see, is accessed by this long and external flight of stairs. In addition, there are two platforms, which are also for playground, which are suspended from and carried by the dead weight of the main building via these 4 steel cables. The most revealing thing about this competition entry is this diagram here, which indicates approximate lighting curves in the classroom over the course of the day, sort of scientific or pseudo-scientific diagram, which really is quintessential functionalism. The influence of the ABC group and similar functionalist groups in Holland and Germany on the Bauhaus slowly changed the approach of the school, which abandoned its earlier craft approach and increasingly focused on the design of standardized industrial products. Architecturally, this influence was reflected in the new buildings which Gropius built when he moved the school from Weimar to Dessau in 1926. You can see that the scheme consists of 5 distinct elements. There's a 3-story workshop block here, fully glazed. Then there's a 5-story school. School rooms. Not good, is it? Anyway, that's where students were taught. That's the top thing. In between, there were social zones, and then on the left-hand side, there's the actual dormitory and the administration wing spanning this road here. Aesthetically, the complex is of course coherent, but the parts themselves were all individually designed according to their specific function, and with no attempt at combining them into one unified whole. So this is very much a functionalist approach, although I must say that this sort of pinwheel grouping with this with the different parts sort of dynamically arranged around the center, still shows a certain this style influence. In 1927, when Gropius finally established an architecture department at the Bauhaus, he appointed Hannes Meyer as its head, and 1 year later Gropius resigned and Meyer succeeded him as the director of the Bauhaus. Meyer steered the Bauhaus away from aesthetic towards social and scientific considerations. He introduced a number of supplementary scientific courses, including psychology, economics, building technology, etc. However, his term as Bauhaus director was short. Meyer was a committed communist, and when the Nazis came to power in this part of Germany in 1930, he was forced to resign, and the school was forced to move to the capital, where the Nazis eventually closed it 3 years later. Now, in educational terms, these last 3 years of the Bauhaus in Berlin were of little significance. Significant, however, was the man who directed it, and that man was Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. May I just ask, how are we getting on with the register? Ah, that's brilliant. Now, Mies, like Gropius, was German, but however, unlike Gropius, he did not come from the liberal, intellectually charged climate of Berlin, but was born far away in the provincial town of Aachen on the Dutch border. Gropius came from a distinguished family of architects. Mies, on the other hand, started out as an apprentice to his father, who was a stonemason. So Mies was a craftsman by training, not an architect. And this may explain his unique reverence for materials and precision in detailing, which he upheld throughout his career. Moreover, there was, particularly in his formative years, a marked Dutch influence in his work, reflected not least by the fact that he added rather pompously van der Rohe to his real name Ludwig Mies to make it sound more patrician and therefore more intriguing. After the First World War, Mies settled in Berlin, where he briefly flirted with expressionist tendencies. You can see this quite clearly in his famous competition entry for an office tower in Friedrichstrasse with this faceted crystalline envelope. The other picture shows a monument for Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, two communist agitators who were killed in the Spartacist uprising of 1919. Unsurprisingly, the Nazis destroyed this monument immediately when they came to power. The monument still has a certain expressionist feel about it, but it also shows very clearly the Dutch influence, especially this sort of unapologetic use of exposed rough-hewn masonry, which recalls the work of famous Dutch architect Hendrik Berlage, and also this sort of asymmetrical dynamic arrangement of the various elements, which obviously is the style influence. That being said, Mies became involved with functionalist groups as early as 1923, and he certainly shared their desire for an economy of means. You have, I suppose, heard of Mies's famous dictum, less is more. Now, to people such as Hannes Meyer, and to a lesser extent, Walter Gropius, it was quite obvious that only in a state-directed industrial and economic system was there any chance that ideas such as standardization, large-scale prefabrication, etc., could ever be fully implemented. In other words, their call for an economy of means had a social and political dimension. They were right, of course. To make prefabrication work on a grand scale, you really need a comprehensively organized, nationally organized building industry. This explains why you have so many vast, repetitive housing estates in communist or formerly communist countries. Now, Mies sympathized with these views, but he was, on the whole, apolitical, and like many successful architects, past and present, effectively an opportunist. His chief motivation between his reductive approach to architecture was aesthetic rather than social or even political. To him, modernism was, above all else, a style. As such, however, it was quite extraordinary. Few, if any, architects in the 20th century managed to exercise such complete control with such minimal means. Prime example of this is the famous pavilion he designed for the International Exhibition in Barcelona in 1929. You can see how the structure of the pavilion is reduced to 8 slender columns, and separated from these elements are a number of space-defining and space-extending planes in opaque and transparent colors, materials. One of these is the roof itself, which has no obvious visual relations to any of the walls. It is supported solely by 8 chromium columns and features a very low profile, which sort of makes it seem to float above the walls. The key thing about the Barcelona pavilion is that it defines space, but it does not enclose it. The fusion of interior and exterior space, which we already saw in the Schröder-Schrader house, is here achieved in perfection. Looking at the plan, the two are almost indistinguishable. So, just to explain, that's the load-bearing structure. Okay? These 8 chromium pillars carry the roof, and the roof is here. And all these walls are merely there to define space. They're completely separated from the load-bearing structure, and they also are not limited to either inside or outside, so they stretch through the actual enclosure or the space defined by the roof. So clear separation of load-bearing structural elements and space-defining elements. Now, such a radical approach was, of course, only possible because this was a temporary and uninhabited pavilion built for an exhibition which took place over the summer in sunny Spain. Mies took advantage of these conditions by proposing what is best understood as an architectural hypothesis. And the lessons he learned, he infused the remainder of his work, most not least his Villa Tugendhat in Brno, Czech Republic, where he first applied these principles in a residential project. Now you can see that Mies used the same architectural elements, such as these cruciform columns here and up there, and also these partition walls into luxurious materials which carry nothing. Okay. Now to one side, on the top, there are these rather substantial foundation walls, because you can see the building was built on a slope. But to the other side, yeah, is vast living space, which must be about 200 square or even 300 square meters, which is essentially one free-flowing space, subdivided or zoned through partition walls and also through furniture, such as this large dining room table. You can see the open glazed corners here, which we already saw with the Fagus design, which really was sort of constant feature in modernist architecture. And there are other really clever detail solutions incorporated in the design of this building. This entire window window front, could be lowered into the parapet to completely open the living room to the exterior. So really fusing interior and exterior space, as we already saw it in the Schröder-Schrader house, but really sort of fabricated with such reduced means, really quite marvelous. Now, all 4 modernist strands that we've discussed so far, Expressionism, De Stijl, Functionalism, and Mies van der Rohe, were one way or the other connected with the Bauhaus, and the way in which the Bauhaus absorbed and amalgamated Mies' influence goes some way in explaining its enormous impact. It really was the place where the various different ideas crystallized into a modernist architectural approach. The last of our four main chapters must be dedicated to an architect who had no official dealings with the Bauhaus. Indeed, although loosely linked with various avant-garde groups, he does occupy a rather singular position in modern architecture. He was Swiss, like Meyer, but his native tongue and cultural disposition was French. I'm referring, of course, to Le Corbusier. He has become a rather controversial figure due to his political opportunism, his anti-Semitism, and his megalomaniac, some would say dictatorial, approach to town planning. By all accounts, he appears to have been a very unpleasant character, but he was also, without doubt, the greatest architect of the 20th century. Corb trained at the School of Arts and Crafts in his hometown of La Chaux-de-Fonds, where in 1905 he also built his very first building at the tender age of 18. But more important for his future work was his stint with Auguste Perret in 1908. Perret introduced Corb to reinforced concrete, which would remain his preferred structural material throughout his career. Most of Corb's buildings of the 1920s and 1930s were variations on a small number of theoretical studies, the most notable of which was the so-called Domino House, which he designed in 1915. This was really the first instance of a reinforced concrete structure being appropriated as the primary expressive element of a building type, consisting, as you can see, of a small number of standardized elements with the potential for mass production. So, the model proposed an open floor plan consisting of concrete slabs supported by lateral pillars and with this lateral staircase leading up to the upper levels. And a further development of this model was the so-called Citoyen House, which you can see on the right top image. Unlike the Domino House, which clearly works best as a freestanding structure open to all sides, this one, the Maison Citoyen, was a solution for the urban, or more precisely suburban, context. Unlike Mies or Gropius, Le Corbusier, throughout his career, had a keen interest in the urban connotations of his architecture, and the Citoyen House links in with his extremely important theoretical work on urbanism, which we have to ignore today, I'm afraid. Now here, Le Corbusier proposed a three-story structure with a double-height living room, bedrooms on the second floor, and a children's room or kitchen on the top floor with a sun terrace. To maximize the functional possibilities, Le Corbusier attaches an external stairway which provided access to the upper levels from the ground floor. There are no columns here. Instead, there are two load-bearing lateral walls, which obviously gives you the possibility of completely opening up to either side if you desire. The Citoyen House is a very, very important modernist prototype. Le Corbusier himself built many houses based on this type, and it still is, copied or interpreted by other architects. Slide shows a variation of this type in Le Corbusier's first large-scale urban commission, Cité Fougères, near Bordeaux. Corb was not only a superb architect, but also a prolific thinker and writer. And it was he who first distilled the sort of core concepts of modern architecture, not just his modern architecture, but modern architecture quite generally, in his famous 5 points of architecture. So these 5 points, what are they? First, pilotis, or pillars. So the liberation of the ground floor by introducing a grid of freestanding supports as load-bearing structure. Secondly, a free plan through the absence of supporting walls. Thirdly, a free facade design through the independence of the structural skeleton from the wall surfaces, a classic feature of modernist architecture, which we already saw at the Barcelona Pavilion. Fourthly, horizontal windows providing equally lit interiors, and only possible, of course, because the external walls don't carry anything. And fifthly, a roof garden, so a new free level on the rooftop, compensating for the loss of the ground level. All these five principles, of course, arise directly from reinforced concrete as Kolb's favorite structural material. And they are all embodied in his best-known work of the 1920s, the Villa Savoie in Poissy. You can see very well this grid of freestanding pilotis, which allows a completely different configuration of space on all three floors. You can also see the free design of the elevations with these characteristic horizontal windows, which do in fact extend to the exterior space as well. Now, what is really quite unique about Le Corbusier is a certain dialectic which characterizes his work. On the one hand, he was a functionalist of sorts who derived his architecture from the specific requirements of his clients, and who produced a number of rather rigorous design rules. However, unlike die-hard functionalists, he never let such rules get in the way of good architecture. He broke his own rules regularly and was more than happy to introduce abstract, non-functional, almost poetic elements purely to evoke an emotional response. Prime example of this is this fascination with a promenade architecturale, an architectural promenade which leads through the entire house and sort of ties the different spaces of the house together. So this ramp here leads from the entrance past this large living room and onto this sheltered terrace, and then from this terrace further up to this sculpturally articulated roof terrace. So one way leading through the entire building and tying all the various spaces together. If you ever get the chance to visit a Corbusier villa in Flèche, I would strongly recommend that you do that. You really have to walk through these buildings to appreciate just how good they are. Anyway, I've shown you five different strands that fed into this narrative of modern architecture in the 10-15 years following the First World War. In future, when you come across this idea of a modernist movement or modern movement, which you certainly will, I would like you to bear in mind that at least in its formative period, this was not a unified movement. Okay, it consisted of a variety of regional groups, some of which had very vastly different philosophies and design approaches. The astonishing thing was that despite these different starting points, these diverse groups eventually did end up speaking a common language. By the late 1920s, the continental modernists had clearly arrived at the recognizable architectural idiom marked by cubic, wide-rendered, flat-roofed, asymmetrical designs. I would like to conclude my talk today by looking at the famous Weissenhof estate in Stuttgart, which was built in 1927 and which marks the occasion when this common language first emerged on an international stage. The Weissenhof estate was another of these famous Werkbund exhibitions which I mentioned earlier. It had the title Die Wohnung, the dwelling, and consisted of 31 buildings providing 60 units of accommodation. Unlike previous exhibitions, this one was built to be permanent, and most of these buildings do in fact still exist and are obviously well worth visiting. Mies van der Rohe was the architectural director of the exhibition, and he commissioned 15 very distinguished architects to design the individual buildings. As you would expect, the majority of these architects were German, like Mies himself, and they were the leading figures in the country at the time. They included Walter Gropius, Hans Pölzig, whose theatre we saw earlier, Bruno Taut, whose glass pavilion we also discussed, and Mies's former employer, Peter Behrens. In addition to these, he handpicked 4 international representatives, Josef Frank from Vienna, 2 Dutch architects, namely Mart Stam, who was a member of the ABC Group, and JJP Oud, who was affiliated with the De Stijl Group, and then, of course, Le Corbusier as well. There was no collaboration between these architects, and Mies's design directives were clearly minimal. Yet, although all these architects tackled their tasks individually, the outcome seemed to show a great degree of unity, if not uniformity, within this new modern architecture. On closer inspection, the various buildings were in fact quite diverse, not just in their programs, but also in their construction. Gropius, for instance, designed a prefabricated house, which is not shown on this slide. Mies produced this long workers' apartment in a sort of composite structure of steel columns and concrete blocks. And Corp designed 2 concrete buildings which were based on the Citroën house and represented his first attempt to realize the 5 points which he had published in the previous year. Yet in spite of these differences, the overwhelming impression was that the buildings of architects of different nationalities and different ideological backgrounds came together effortlessly to create a coherent image at the Weissenhof. Evidently, there was considerable similarity and overlap in their approaches, which suggested that they were indeed part of a nascent international movement. In light of this, it was perhaps not surprising that 1 year after the Weissenhof exhibition, many of these architects followed an invitation by Swiss art historian Siegfried Giedion and Le Corbusier, whom you can see there encircled in yellow, to an international conference at Lasserre, Switzerland. Here they inaugurated the International Congress of Modern Architecture, which was essentially an international forum for the discussion, codification and dissemination of modern architecture amongst the lay public, but more importantly, amongst policymakers. Accordingly, SIAM put great emphasis on publicizing its proceedings and findings, and the slide shows you the 3 publications which emerged from the pre-war conferences. In the early years, the agenda of SIAM was largely driven by the German and Swiss functionalists. The Second Congress, for instance, dealt with the minimal requirements of dwellings. The goal here was to arrive at universal standards which would enable prefabrication for mass social housing. And the shining example was the housing program at Frankfurt, where such experiments were taking place at the very grand scale, which is also why this conference was held at Frankfurt. At subsequent gatherings, the focus shifted even further to questions of planning rather than architecture per se. The Third Congress in Brussels was concerned with rational land development, and the Fourth Congress, which took place on a Mediterranean cruise from Athens to Marseille, was about the analysis and future planning of cities. The delegates agreed 4 basic functions of a city: dwelling, work, recreation and transport, which Le Corbusier later published as the so-called Athens Charter, a key document for post-war architecture. Simultaneously with these activities, which were at the time still largely limited to Western Europe, the architectural idiom, modernism, began to spread to other parts of the world. The first ones who took it up were often themselves émigré architects, as was the case in Britain and in the United States. And the slide shows on the right-hand side 2 buildings built for the same sympathetic client, the Lovell Beach House by Rudolf Schindler and the Lovell House by Richard Neutra. Schindler and Neutra were 2 Austrian architects who settled in Southern California in the early 1920s. Local followers often gained their inspiration from such émigré architects, or more often from images in architectural magazines. And it was perhaps inevitable that at least initially their efforts rarely matched the quality of the originals. However, there were exceptions. The best, most notable perhaps, the Finnish architect Alvar Aalto, superb architect, and this is his main building, or his most famous building, the sanatorium in Finland. By the way, Professor Ray published a really good monograph about Alvar Aalto, which is well worth reading. The first modernist building in Britain was this little house in Northampton, designed by Peter Behrens, and programmatically called New Ways, but on the whole not a terribly inspired building. That was in 1925, and in the following years a number of other similar villas were built in England, mostly in and around London. The first truly original British contribution to modern architecture, I would argue, was the Boots factory in Nottingham, built between 1930 and 1932. The man who designed this, Owen Williams, produced other equally interesting projects in the following years, but he almost remained somewhat on the margins of the so-called modern movement in Britain, partly because he didn't really subscribe fully to this movement, but more importantly because he was in fact an engineer, not an architect. So he really didn't fit very well with the architecture crowd. Next week, Neil Chazor will tell you everything you need to know about the interwar period in Britain, and in the following weeks, Professor Jackson will do the same for the United States. The Americans, as usually, were very quick on picking up on these European trends. In 1931, Philip Johnson, the architectural director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and Henry Russell Hitchcock, an art historian, staged an exhibition at the MoMA with the title The International Style, Architecture Since 1922. And in the following year, they published a catalogue with the same title. Now, the MoMA exhibition was still largely concerned with the European avant-garde, so leaving aside the question whether modernism was merely a new style or whether it was indeed an entirely new approach to architecture, as its advocates claimed and continue to claim, international was clearly a bit of a stretch. The exhibition featured 48 architects, more than half of them German. It does seem almost paradoxical that although a continental movement is and was inconceivable without significant German participation, it was only when Germany dropped out of the picture from 1933 onward that the foundations for a truly international architecture were laid. The sad reason for this lies, of course, in the fact that almost all of the early modernists, many of them Jewish or communists or both, had to leave the country and find a new home elsewhere where they spread their ideas amongst the locals. Gropius, for instance, spent a few rather unproductive years in Britain before moving to the United States, where he took over Harvard GSD. Mies van der Rohe also went to the United States and became the director of the IIT. Taut fled to Switzerland and then moved on to Japan and finally ended up in Turkey. Mayer, committed communist that he was, moved to the Soviet Union, then ended up being a government advisor in Mexico, and in the end retired in his home country in Switzerland. The only leading modernist who stuck it out in Europe was Le Corbusier, and apart from his sheer creative force, this was presumably one of the main reasons why he emerged as such a guiding figure in the post-war period. By the way, this rare postcard here shows the Weissenow through the eyes of the Nazis. So, housing scheme as an entirely un-German design populated by Bedouin tribesmen with camels, the epitome of cultural decadence in the eyes of the Nazis. Evidently, the Second World War put an end to any sustained architectural development, modernist or otherwise, and it wasn't until the late 1940s that a truly international style did begin to emerge. The slide shows the Lakeshore apartments, one of a series of buildings by which Mies van der Rohe and other American architects established a highly reduced skin and bone architecture for high-rises, which from the late 1940s onwards spread as a sort of corporate functionalism all across the globe. The same is true for the rather more expressive brutalism, which at roughly the same time emerged as a global phenomenon completely based on Le Corbusier's post-war work. All this and more will be covered in great detail in a future lecture, which is why I would like to conclude at this juncture.